PBXs, SIP endpoints, and some heritage Avaya PBXs. I kind of prefer my drawing there. And here's some session manager functionality. So the first one, and I would say the most important one, is to be a centralized SIP routing engine. It's going to allow you to route to different places via SIP. Session manager is also about integration. It allows you to integrate with other vendors using the SIP protocol. Even though SIP is a standard, every vendor uses the standard in a different way because they had to accommodate with whatever they had, going on. And then session manager is capable of modifying some SIP headers so that the message is able to be understood by the destination. Session manager also has a SIP firewall known as the SM100. I'll talk about that one later. Session manager is scalable, which means that you could have multiple session managers in a cluster. In release 6.3, you could have up to 12 session managers. In release 7, you could have up to 28 session managers in a cluster. A cluster of session managers is pretty much all of those session managers managed by the same system manager. That's a cluster of session managers. So 28, that's a lot of session managers in release 7. Because each session manager is capable of registering up to 21,000 SIP endpoints. So normally you'd have multiple session managers not because you have that many endpoints, but normally because of survivability reasons. High availability and redundancy. So this one here just means that it's kind of hard to see in the slide, but you could also have a branch session manager. So besides those 28 session managers you could have in the core, you could also have a branch session managers, which is another session manager for the branch. In case you have SIP endpoints on the branch and the branch loses connectivity with the main data centers, then you still have survivability by having a branch session manager. You could potentially have in release 7 up to 500 branch session managers.
Is that like an LSP, for example? Or?
That's similar to an LSP, but it's a session manager. So normally what you have in the branch is a branch session manager and an LSP.
Okay.
And that's for when you have Avaya SIP phones, then they will register to the branch session manager and grab features from the LSP. Because remember that the Avaya phones register with session manager and grab features from CM. So in the branch, if the branch loses connectivity with the main data center, where your main session manager and main CM is, then they register with the branch session manager and grab features from the LSP or ESS.
Okay.
So those are going to be two applications in the branch. A branch session manager and a CM survivable server that could be an LSP or a ESS. And in release 6.3, you were able to have up to 250 branch session managers. In release 7, you're able to have 500 branch session managers. Registration and authentication. It's just the capability of session manager to register SIP phones, SIP endpoints. Okay, session manager purpose. We kind of already talked about this. It's to provide centralized call routing as well as provide service for SIP endpoints in a secure, scalable, and highly available manner. Here in page 16, we also see the session manager functions as a sophisticated, secure SIP routing engine. Question for you on page 17, so that you don't fall asleep. What's the purpose of Avaya or session manager? Select 2.
first two.
C is one of them, yeah,
A
provide
and B.
zip service.
A and C.
A and C.
A and C, yeah.
This question is on one of the, is in ACSS, ACIS, one of those exams.
No, no. However, I did,
No.
I took the exam.
Yeah, we just took it.
Just
The 7220 class includes
Yep.
a question almost verbatim.
Verbatim, yeah.
I took recently the 7120 exam, and so were you saying that you remember these questions?
This was on,
Is that-
I think this was on 7220, I think.
Ah, okay.
I just did
okay.
both together, so I don't remember which was
I don't
which.
remember which one, but I've memorized. It's definitely right.
Okay, okay, good to know. I didn't remember this one in particular, but if I see something that I know it's in the exam, I'll point it out, because I still have some questions fresh. What's the function of Avaya or a session manager? How did it go? Did you pass?
Isn't this the same question?
Kind of the
Or
same.
purpose and
Kind of the
function.
same. yeah.
Purpose and function.
Or what's the
C.
function of
Yeah.
C? Act as a sophisticated SIP routing engine, and also
And D.
D.
and D, integrate
Yeah.
disparate networks. By disparate, they mean you know, like
Third party.
PBXs, yeah, and also PBXs that could potentially have different dial plans. That's what they mean with disparate networks. You know, maybe one PBX has a 7-digit dial plan, and the other one a 5-digit dial plan, and maybe some of them overlap. So you could potentially integrate those through session manager. Evolution of the IMS enterprise network.
What's IMS?
IMS stands for IP Multimedia Subsystem, and it's a framework. It's not developed by Avaya. It's just a framework that was created to carry multimedia, different types of media. Okay, so we'll have a look back. Here, let's start at page 21 with the legacy TDM Pbx. And there were a lot of inconveniences with this approach, the legacy TDM Pbx. Let me just move this a little bit. And everything you see here on the bottom is considered pretty much a problem because of that approach. So with the legacy TDM, we had a limited scope. If you wanted to have multiple locations, you pretty much needed to have multiple systems, one on each location. There was a lack of geo-redundancy, resources very bound to the PBX, scalability was an issue, limited mobility, huge footprint. The system was primarily designed for voice. The PBX owns the entire user experience, which means that your users are asking for a feature that the PBX doesn't provide. Well, sorry. Devices are tightly bound to the PBX, which means that if you have an Avaya PBX, you need Avaya phones. Devices are unsophisticated. Can you guys see from there? Let me see. I'm kind of in the middle. You're good? Okay. Devices are unsophisticated, which means that, well, actually, yeah, those were TDM devices, either digital or analog, so yeah, they were not very sophisticated. New services usually mean an upgrade. Single vendor, meaning that if you have an Avaya PBX like CM, you needed an Avaya voicemail, an Avaya conferencing system, everything from Avaya. And application integration limitations, which means that most of your integrations happen through the AES. And there's some limitations when you integrate by using the AES. What I actually like about this slide is these three layers: the access layer, connection layer, and application layer. And I like them because I see here right away that they're kind of bound together. They're bound together to the same in the same physical box. In the access layer, we have the phones. In the connection layer, we have the gateways. And in the application layer, we have the servers, the telephony server. And in this approach, all of those things are kind of bounded to the same physical box. You're going to see in the next page the IP Pbx. And you're gonna see that the main difference with the Ip Pbx is that the access layer was detached from the connection layer. And now it communicates with it via IP. And with that change, some of the problems were fixed by detaching the access layer from the connection layer. Like for example, one of them is that now if you wanted to have multiple locations, you didn't need multiple systems. You could have an IP phone, let's say an AC23 phone, on a remote location, registered with a CM that's on another location. You normally have a server there, or a gateway, but this is just more for survivability reasons. You don't really need it, right? You could register that phone with CM, even if they're in different locations. But with this approach, we still have some problems. Like PBX still owns the entire user experience, because if the PBX doesn't offer a feature that the user is asking for, again, well, sorry, user. Devices are still tightly bound to the PBX, which is that you have an Avaya PBX, you need Avaya phones. So all of these problems remain. Now, with the IMS approach, the IP Multimedia Subsystem approach, notice that the big change is that now all of the layers are detached from one another. You see? And now in the connection layer, we have session manager. And notice that now we no longer have only one application, but we have applications, multiple applications. One of them is the telephony application, but you could have more applications that allow you to communicate somehow. And we live in a world of applications, and you see it every day when you download applications to your phone, and they allow you to communicate in different ways. So now we not only have the telephony application, but more applications that allow us to communicate in a certain way. So now in the connection layer, we have session manager, and in the access layer, we have the phones, but not only the phones, but also maybe the third-party PBXs that are trying to reach some application. So session manager, which is in the connection layer, notice that it's nothing more than the bridge between those users trying to reach some features and the feature servers on top. Those could be Avaya feature servers or non-Avaya feature servers. And session manager is that bridge between the users here and those feature servers. Here we see the same thing, but with things more specific. So again, notice that session manager is in the middle. You could have one or a cluster of session managers. And on the bottom, you have your Avaya SIP endpoints, the third-party SIP endpoints. But not only that, but they could be just endpoints registered to some other type of PBXs. And all of them want to access features on top, coming from different applications. They could be Avaya applications or non-Avaya applications. What's MM?
Modular messaging.
Modular messaging. MX, have you heard of that one?
Meeting exchange.
Meeting exchange, that's an Avaya conferencing solution. VP, that's voice portal, the Avaya IVR, that now it's the experience portal. CC is the contact center application. CM is the telephony application. ACE, this one was rebranded with Breeze. This ACE is now known as Breeze. And actually it was rebranded to EDP, Engagement Development Platform. And that just survived like probably 6 months. Someone didn't like that name. And they changed it. Yeah, it's not catchy at all. So they changed it to Avaya Breeze. That's Avaya Breeze now. You see, so that's what you have. And notice that you have here System Manager as the centralized management tool to not only manage session manager, but you could potentially manage some other applications. Like Presence, one of them that needs to be managed through System Manager. But some other applications, right, could be managed as well from System Manager. Here's kind of the same picture, just to let you know that even though you could go with other vendors for feature servers, Avaya has everything you need. You need a voicemail solution, Avaya has it. Do you need a conferencing solution? Avaya has it. So it's the kind of the same picture, but everything in red. By the way, now that we see Avaya Aura, Aura means, that word Aura means that that application is ready to be embedded in a SIP environment. So when Avaya first started to talk about Avaya Aura, the only 3 applications that had Aura embedded in the name of the application were System Manager, Session Manager, and CM. So that's why we started to say, okay, that's Avaya Aura Communication Manager, Avaya Aura System Manager, Avaya Aura Session Manager. And those were the first 3 applications that adopted the Avaya Aura name. And then other applications started to be called Avaya Aura whatever. And it's because that means that that application is ready to be embedded in a SIP environment. Question for you. Which of the following best describes the IP multimedia subsystem? Pick one. A. Multi-vendor open and flexible network architecture. And that's it.
Yeah,
Notice that the other 3 have some sort of restrictions, so the one that's more open is A. Avaya Aura network architecture. So we're going to see in the next sections an overview of some components, and we'll talk about the things that you see here on this slide. Let's see, Session Manager instance and SIP entities. So you could have in release 7 up to 28 Session Manager instances. Every time an application wants to communicate with one of those Session Manager instances, that application needs to be defined as a SIP entity. Otherwise, Session Manager doesn't trust on communications coming from that application. So every application that wants to directly communicate with Session Manager needs to be defined as a SIP entity. So in this example here, the Pbx needs to be defined as a SIP entity. PSTN service provider, this would have to be defined as a SIP entity. The adjuncts, the gateway, everything that wants to communicate with Session Manager needs to be defined as a SIP entity. Another thing that you notice here is that now we have a SIP domain. So in SIP, the identifier of the user is not only an extension number, but it's an extension number and a domain. You're used probably right now to only have an identifier for the user as the extension number of that user. In SIP, the identifier of the user is what we know as the SIP URI. SIP URI. URI stands for Unique Record Identifier. But that SIP URI has a username portion and a domain portion. The username, most of the time, is an extension number. It could be something else. It could be a name. You know, my SIP URI could be nestor@avaya.com. Has the structure of an email address, as you see. But, you know, we're dealing with telephony, and most of the time that username portion, it's an extension number. You know, the SIP URI is something like 1234 at some domain. But what I want to point out is that the entire thing is the identifier of the user. So if you are 1234 at avaya.com and you're 1234 at, let's say, nortel.com, you're completely 2 different users, even though you're using the same extension number, because you have a different SIP URI. Okay? So the domain matters. That domain, that SIP domain, only matters internally, to route internally within the enterprise. that domain is replaced when it gets to the when the call gets to the SBC. That domain is replaced with the public IP address that you have set up here on the SBC. So outside, they don't get to see that SIP domain. That SIP domain is only local to you. It could be just a SIP domain that you come up with. It doesn't have to be a real published, SIP domain or routable domain. It's just an internal domain to route within the enterprise. How does session manager route traffic within the IMS network? We're going to see that there are two ways in which session manager could route traffic. One of them is known as registry routing and the other one as network routing policy. Let's start with registry routing. And just for now, forget about this CM. Just take that CM out of the picture. So in registry routing, and also let's suppose that user 1 wants to call user 2 here. The two of them are registered with this session manager. So registry routing happens when the destination has a user profile created in session manager. Okay, so in this case, if user 1 wants to call user 2, if the destination, in this case user 2, has a user profile created in session manager, then session manager uses registry routing to route that call. And you, as the administrator of session manager, don't have to do anything for that call to be routed. Okay? The reason why you don't have to do anything is because when user 2 registers with session manager using that user profile created in session manager, then session manager knows the IP address of this user. Not only the IP address, but also the SIP URI. So every time someone tries to reach that user, session manager simply proxies the request to that IP address. And that's why you, as the administrator of session manager, don't need to do anything for this call to be routed. And it's because the destination has a user profile in session manager. That's the main thing. That's the main question that you need to ask yourself every time you want to know how session manager is routing that call. The other way, the other way of routing is through network routing policies in page 32. So network routing policies are applied when the destination doesn't have a user profile in session manager. Think about this. In this case, we have an H223 phone registered to CM trying to call another H223 phone, in this case registered to the Ip Pbx, the CS1K. So this guy dials 2701. That goes to his CM. His CM routes that call to session manager by using some routing method in CM that could be ARS, AR. We don't care about that right now. We care about how session manager routes that call. So let me ask you one question. This is the destination. Does the destination have a user profile created in session manager? The answer is no. The profile of this user is created in the CS1K, not in session manager. And therefore, since there is no user profile for this user in session manager uses a network routing policy to route that call. That's why the main question you want to ask yourself to know how session manager is routing is, does the destination have a user profile in session manager? If it does have one, session manager uses SIP registry routing, the one that we saw in the previous slide. If it doesn't have a user profile in session manager, then session manager uses network routing policies. That's it. Does the destination have a user profile in session manager? Yes or no?
You said the destination, but what if the starting point doesn't have one? That's HTTP.
In that case, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because what's evaluated is always the destination. So it really doesn't matter where the call is coming from. You know, once it gets to session manager, it gets to session manager, and then from there, you need to know how session manager is going to route that call to the destination. So the source is never evaluated, it's always the destination. So what I'm saying is that this could be maybe a SIP phone, registered directly to session manager, and still would be network routing policies if the SIP phone is trying to call the H223. SIP tracing, we're gonna see later how to trace in session manager. This is an example of TraceSM. Have you seen it? Have you used it before? You're gonna like it, and I'll show you as much as I know in relation to TraceSM.
No, that's right.
In this case, we see a register message. We'll talk about this later when we trace. You know, the SIP phone is registering with session manager, and you're gonna see that in SIP, this message is first unauthorized, and then the phone creates an authorization key with the password that you entered and a challenge that session manager provides, and then the next register message goes through because it has that authorization key. So this is normal in SIP, you know, it's a SIP behavior, and you're gonna see it not only with registrations, but with invites, with subscribes, with some other type of request. So what I'm talking about, notice that this register message goes, it's kind of hard to tell, but goes here. This is gonna be your session manager, and session manager says unauthorized, 401 unauthorized. And then the entity sends again the register message, and this time is answered with a 200 OK. So the second registration, or the second attempt, goes through, is successful, and it's because this second attempt will have an authorization key. I mean, if you open up the message, the difference that you'll see between the second registration and the first one is just a SIP header, which is an authorization key that is built with, in this case, with the password that you enter when you try to register. And then because of that authorization key, the phone is able to register. Kind of a challenge and response method, like for example in CM, when you use the super users, CM gives you a challenge, and with that challenge you you enter a response. Similar, you know, kind of similar to that. It's kind of a challenge and response. So pretty much session manager is challenging the phone, and the phone then builds with that challenge an authorization key that it uses to register. That's pretty much what's happening. Session manager feature application integration, just to let you know that session manager is capable of integrating with different applications. They could be non-Avaya applications. Same deal here in page 35, integration and adaptation. Remember that even though SIPs are standard, every vendor uses the standard in a different way. So session manager is capable of modifying that SIP message so that the destination understands the message. Sequencing. Another capability of session manager is sequencing, which means that you're able to create a sequence of applications to be invoked when a user either places a call or receives a call. So in this example, you could create a sequence, let's say, for when user 1 places a call, so that in that call, maybe first CM is invoked as a feature server, then maybe another feature server is invoked, like this enhanced caller ID feature server, and then the call blocker feature server is invoked. So pretty much what you would configure is a sequence where, in my example, CM would be the first in the sequence, the enhanced caller ID would be the second application in the sequence, and the call blocker would be the third. And then you assign that sequence to the user, so every time the user places a call, that sequence of applications is invoked.
Would that be something that, like, let's say a quality quality monitoring system like Verint would
Exactly, or call recording.
Oh,
It could
right.
be, yeah.
Okay.
And you have the flexibility to say who comes first.
Okay.
You know, so that sequencing, and you're gonna see that through sequencing is that we actually relate CM with the Avaya SIP phones, so that every time the SIP phones, the Avaya SIP phones place a call or receive a call, CM is in the picture. So we're gonna see later, that's gonna happen on Friday, that through sequence applications, we're gonna relate CM with the Avaya SIP phones. And CM is going to be, in our case, the only application in the sequence, but you could have more than one application in that sequence. Tail end hop off. So this is actually not something that's new. Tail end hop off is pretty much the capability of routing a call or a request through a non-expensive network, and at the end hop off to a more expensive network. So in this case, notice that Jim in North America wants to call Bob, who's in Australia, and instead of calling all the way to Australia through the PSTN, Jim takes advantage that there are different branches and that there is an IP trunk between his branch and the branch in Australia, so he places that call first through the IP trunk, and at the very end, he jumps or hops off to the more expensive network, which is the PSTN. So I was saying that this is not new. This is something that you normally do. However, if you have session managers, easier to configure. Because for a second, forget that you have that session manager there, and imagine that on each location, you have a CM, let's say, and a standalone CM, and you want to configure the tail end of hop-off behavior. You would need to go to each CM and have some different configuration, right? Now, if you have session manager, what you're doing is you're kind of moving the routing capability from CM, or the routing decision, let's say, from CM to session manager. So if you have session manager picture, all you need to do in CM is send everything to session manager. And then in session manager, you configure routing. So configuring this kind of stuff is just easier because you only do it in one place, as long as your CM routes everything to session manager. That probably is not going to happen right away in your environment, because you still have these T1s right here, and also your CM maybe has some other ways of routing, but in the future, the carrier is not going to give you these T1s anymore. Right? So in the future, you could eventually move the routing decision from CM to session manager, so that CM actually sends everything, no matter what, to session manager, and session manager is the one who decides where to go from there. Maybe go to the voicemail, maybe go to the IVR, maybe go out through the SBC, maybe go to another PBX, you know? So then configuring things like this, it's gonna be easier.
So like in the old system, or CM for example, if you had an office in New York and an office in Beijing and you wanted to make a long distance call to Shanghai, you could in CM create some sort of an alternate routing, AAR, to send a call to your Shanghai office, and then Shanghai sees it coming in on a particular trunk and sends it out through their local trunk. So you're really only making a local call from Shanghai and not a long distance call from New York. What you're saying then is, by utilizing Session Manager, you can have all of that programming done in one
place.
In one place.
Yeah.
As long as you point all your routing to the session manager, that's
Exactly.
the big
As long as your 3 PBXs say everything just goes to session manager no matter what, and then in your session manager you configure routing.
Right. Yeah, we just started doing that with our IP offices. We have like a RP913 or route plan that specifically takes the calls through SIP trunks up to. Yeah.
And I've seen some customers already starting to do that, you know, and they're just blacking out all of the routing in CM.
Everything's 11 digits at that point.
Okay.
And everything, and you see now the AR tables in CM, they're empty.
Yeah.
Because you're sending everything to session manager for session manager to be able to.
Okay.
And that's the
make
thing,
the
that
routing.
hop was actually what we called it back in the olden days when they did that. You know, routing over long distance networks to a local thing. They call it like in ARS programming or something hop. It was very complicated back
Yeah.
in the olden days.
Do be careful of hop-offs.
PTTs.
There are definitely some players, some countries
Yeah.
that strongly forbid it.
Well, like PTTs, like in some of the more like communist bloc countries.
Yeah.
Like, I think China is one of them.
India
even.
is
India, yeah.
absolute lockdown. They have a requirement for CDR output from every enterprise PBX solution,
Right.
and they monitor that CDR to see call from New York routed locally. Wait a minute, and they're
Right.
all over.
Because they don't want to lose
Their income.
right, exactly, and those are like state-run phone companies.
State telecom.
Yeah.
So do be real careful. You can get yourself in a bind.
Well, that's ironic that India didn't want to lose their income to us.
Right.
Same deal with something like least cost routing. It's not something new, it's just that it would be easier to configure. You know, if you have your routing decision only in one place, that being session manager. Scale and redundancy. Wanna have a break?
Yep.